In under 5 minutes, a Supreme Court judge slammed Jasmine Crockett with a $15,000 fine. No trial, no evidence, no warning. But what he didn't know? That the quiet woman standing before him had come armed with something far more dangerous than fear: the truth. What was supposed to be a swift, one-sided takedown spiraled into a courtroom clash so explosive it shattered silence and exposed corruption at its core. Can one woman, staring down unchecked power, rewrite the rules of justice right in front of their eyes? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The frost hadn't yet lifted from the marble steps of the United States Supreme Court when Jasmine Crockett arrived, alone, unshaken, and dressed for war. She wasn't just another attorney walking into the country's highest judicial chamber. She was a former military prosecutor, trained to stare down armed insurgents and outmaneuver hostile command. Raised by an Iraq War veteran in a tough Houston neighborhood, Jasmine learned early that silence meant survival, but defiance meant freedom. She never bowed to power without justice. As she stepped through the Supreme Court doors, she carried not fear, but fire. The courtroom was pristine, polished like power always is. But the real danger wasn't in the design. It was seated high on the bench, draped in black robes and staring with eyes that didn't blink. Justice Victor Halden, Supreme Court Justice, the man who didn't just interpret law, he rewrote it with gavel and glare. He was a legend in conservative legal circles, feared in liberal ones, and utterly unmoved by precedent. He ruled not by weighing facts, but by wielding authority like a blade. And today, Jasmine Crockett stood directly in his crosshairs. The hearing was billed as administrative, nothing more than a minor procedural session. But what waited inside was no formality. It was a legal execution without a firing squad. No press, no appeal, just a fine, a ruling, and silence. Jasmine wasn't just entering a courtroom. She was walking into a trap laid by a man who thought power made him untouchable. But he hadn't met her kind of justice yet. She had barely pulled out her chair when it happened. No roll call, no case summary, no reading of facts into the record. Justice Halden didn't even look up from his bench. His voice, smooth but sterile, cut through the courtroom like the snap of a cold wind. Ms. Crockett, you are fined $15,000. This decision is final and takes effect immediately. No questions, no explanation, no evidence entered, no charges read aloud, no agency report, no affidavit, not even a citation on the record. It was a ruling with no foundation, a sentence with no crime. Jasmine blinked once. That was all. She didn't move, didn't speak. She had been in war zones before, but this was a different kind of ambush, one that came dressed in robes and wrapped in protocol. The attorneys seated nearby stiffened, but no one dared make a sound. The air in the chamber thickened, heavy with the weight of a moment that everyone understood, but no one dared acknowledge. This wasn't law. This was domination. Justice Halden never explained himself. He didn't need to. His reputation did the talking. Known across the judiciary as a man who ruled more by instinct than inquiry, he wielded discretion like a weapon, precise, swift, and unquestioned. In his courtroom, due process wasn't a right, it was a privilege, and today Jasmine had been stripped of it before she'd said a single word. The court clerk avoided her gaze. The stenographer paused before typing, as if unsure whether this ruling should even be recorded. And the other attorneys, veterans of countless hearings, suddenly looked like interns again, avoiding eye contact, staring at their shoes. Because when a Supreme Court justice speaks like that, you don't correct him. You disappear. The silence in the room was not peace. It was fear. The kind of fear that doesn't come from yelling or chaos, but from power that knows it doesn't have to explain itself. A ruling handed down without reason, without room for rebuttal, isn't just unfair, it's un-American. Jasmine knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. But still, no one stood. No one objected. Because challenging Halden meant putting your career, your credibility, maybe your entire future on the line. And yet here she was, the only person in the room with nothing to hide, yet the only one being punished. And that's when she realized This wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. A display. A performance of power meant to humiliate her. No evidence, no argument, no record, just a number and a name, thrown like a stone in a silent lake. The kind of move that's meant to break someone before they even start to fight. But Jasmine wasn't broken. She was just getting started. And that's when she did the one thing no one in that room expected. Her chair creaked softly as she rose, slow and deliberate. Not in protest, but in precision. Her eyes never left the bench. She didn't need permission to speak, because what had just happened wasn't justice. It was execution. And executions, she knew from war, should never happen in silence. So she stood tall, spine straight, breath steady, and spoke not with anger, but with clarity that cut sharper than any objection. If justice can pass sentence in silence, she said, her voice low but unshakably firm, then today I will be the noise it cannot ignore. The words didn't echo. They detonated. You could feel it. The room didn't just hear her. It stopped for her. Every eye that had been avoiding hers now lifted, drawn by something they hadn't expected. Defiance with discipline. Not a tantrum. Not a plea. A statement. Measured, dangerous, undeniable. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated before continuing, as if unsure whether to commit those words to the permanent record or hold them in reverence. Holden didn't flinch, but his jaw locked tight. He had expected a target. What he got was a threat, a legal one. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but the pressure in the room did. And in that moment, for the first time all morning, Holden wasn't the only one in control. The courtroom, still reeling from the shock of her defiance, hadn't even caught its breath when Jasmine moved again. Quiet, composed, but now unmistakably in command. With one hand, she unlatched her leather folder and unfolded a stack of documents so thick they landed on the table with a soft, heavy thud, like the sound of something permanent. The papers weren't just printed, they were lived in. Corners bent, tabs marked with red, sentences underlined 3 times. Margins filled with sharp, slanted handwriting in pen. Her pen. Years of field experience, case law, and sleepless nights condensed into a battle plan. She didn't fumble. She didn't stall. She turned to the first tab without so much as a glance down, already knowing exactly where the cracks in the system lived. Then, in a voice as calm as it was cutting, she began. Let the record reflect that this court is not without guidance. She held up the first case like a loaded weapon. Sullivan v. State of Illinois, 2017. A property owner fined under an obscure municipal code with no photos, no inspection logs, no report, just the word of one enforcement officer. The fine was appealed. The appellate court struck it down, calling the entire process a violation of due process under both state and federal law. Jasmine read the quote aloud, slowly, deliberately, and let it hang in the air. The silence didn't feel like tension anymore. It felt like anticipation. Without pause, she flipped to the next page. Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg, 2019. Another administrative fine. No images, no timestamp. Just one man's observation that something looked wrong. She pointed to the highlighted ruling in the court's opinion. Subjective interpretation cannot be the sole basis for penalty. Enforcement demands documentation. Period. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't need applause. This wasn't theater. It was dissection. With every case, she stripped the authority from Holden's words and replaced them with law, real law, not opinion, not tradition, not fear wrapped in a robe. She wasn't raising a defense. She was exposing a failure, and not just his. Jasmine turned another page, another citation, another overturned judgment, then another. The folder became heavier with each turn, not physically but symbolically. This wasn't one isolated injustice. This was a pattern, a quiet epidemic of unchecked power, ignored precedent, and rubber-stamped punishment. And in the middle of it, a woman who refused to let it stand. Her voice remained steady, but her words hit like hammers. If this court stands on precedent, then let it stand on all of it. Not the parts that are convenient, not the parts that reinforce power, but the parts that protect people, Because what happened here today, no evidence, no hearing, no process, is not enforcement. It's assumption. And assumption is not law. She paused just for a breath. Not for drama, but for precision. And no bench, no matter how high, can stand on assumption alone. That was no longer a lawyer speaking. That was the law speaking through her. And just as the courtroom began to shift, just as Jasmine's words started piercing the polished armor of tradition, Halden snapped. The authority he wore like a second skin began to crack, not from volume, but from exposure. His hands slammed against the bench with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot in a vault. His voice, now stripped of its usual cold control, rose in sudden fury. "That's enough, Ms. Crockett. You are out of order. This court does not recognize these claims, nor will it entertain baseless lectures on constitutional theory." The gallery froze, stunned. The man who had moments ago issued quiet rulings like stone tablets from a mountaintop was now shouting, unraveling in real time. Halden's face flushed, his jaw clenched, and he pointed directly at her. "One more word and you will be held in contempt of court," he barked, spitting the words with venom. "You will be removed immediately. Do you understand me?" It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning shot, meant to silence not just Jasmine, but every person who might ever think to speak as she did. She was standing on the precipice, staring down a legal abyss where truth didn't matter and precedent could be erased with volume. This was no longer about a fine. It was about power screaming back when it realized it might lose control. The courtroom had become a battlefield of voices, and Halden had just declared war. But Jasmine didn't back down. Not when threatened, not when silenced, not when the full weight of a Supreme Court justice came crashing down like a hammer. Instead, she stood straighter. Her voice didn't rise. It became clearer, firmer, like steel being drawn. This wasn't passion, it was precision. She placed her hand firmly on the thick folder in front of her and flipped to the next section with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head. "If you want to dismiss legal precedent," she said, locking eyes with Halden, "fine. But you won't dismiss real people. Not today." The room tightened around her. No one interrupted, not because they were scared of her, but because something about this moment felt heavier than law. She wasn't just addressing a judge anymore. She was speaking to a broken system, and everyone could feel it. She began with Daniel Rhee. War veteran, transmission mechanic. He opened his own garage in Tulsa and kept it running for 22 years, she said plainly. Then one day a glitch in the city's renewal system caused him to miss a checkbox, one tiny mistake on a form. He got no warning, no call, just an automatic license suspension overnight. She flipped a page. He appealed, no one responded. The next morning, a compliance sticker was taped to his window. Business closed by city order. Just like that. She let the words sink in. In less than 3 months, he lost his customers, his shop, and then his house. The city finally admitted the mistake. 6 months too late. What did they give him? A 2-line apology letter. No help, no responsibility. Her voice turned colder. This man survived a war, but got destroyed by a checkbox. She didn't wait. Next, Karen Bautista, 15-year licensed electrician in Savannah. Not a single safety complaint on her record. She trained others. She built a name. Then the city quietly changed its license code. No notice, no outreach. And overnight, her credentials didn't count anymore. Jasmine paused. She showed up to a job site and was told she couldn't pull permits. Not because she lost her skill, but because someone behind a desk rewrote the rules. Jasmine flipped another page. She asked for a copy of the new code. They told her it was internal. She filed a complaint. They ignored it. She lost clients, her crew, and eventually her entire business. She had to move to Florida and start over from zero. She wasn't fired, she was erased. Then came the final story. James Weller, retired truck driver, lived outside Waco, Texas. He bought a small plot of land and built a cedar fence with his own hands, she said slower now. Paid for every board himself, but 17 inches of that fence crossed into an unmarked public easement. She looked up, expression hardening. The city fined him over $10,000. No warning, just a notice. When he asked for a survey, they told him, It's already been decided. Jasmine's voice dropped, but it only made the room quieter. He tore it down himself, worked 2 days in the heat. On the third day, they fined him again for not finishing the demolition fast enough. She looked Halden straight in the eye. That's what this system does. It doesn't correct, it crushes. She took a breath. Her tone was colder now. Every word hit with weight. To these people, rulings like this destroy everything. Their jobs, their homes, their dignity. To them, this is a financial death sentence. But to you, she stepped forward slightly, it's just a signature. And then, nothing, not a word, not a breath. The courtroom was frozen in place, like time had stopped. No chairs creaked, no pens moved. Even the bailiff looked like a statue. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of the weight of everything she had just said. Jasmine hadn't just brought files, she had brought lives, laid bare for all to see. She wasn't arguing anymore. She was exposing, she was holding the entire system up to the light. And that's when Halden snapped. His pride couldn't handle the truth laid bare before him, not from a lawyer he expected to crush in 5 minutes. He slammed his gavel down so hard it cracked the silence into shards. His face burned red with fury, and when he spoke, it wasn't as a judge, it was as a man who'd just been cornered. You dare challenge me in my courtroom? He roared, voice shaking with rage. I am the law here. The gallery recoiled, some gasping audibly, others frozen in disbelief. This wasn't judicial authority, it was ego unmasked. Halden pointed toward the bailiffs, his hand trembling not from fear, but from fury he no longer cared to hide. Remove her. Now she's in contempt. Get her out of here. 2 officers moved instantly, their hands already reaching for Jasmine's arms. You could feel the electricity in the room spike, that horrifying moment where everyone wondered, is this really happening? But Jasmine didn't move. Her stance didn't change. And just as one of the bailiffs stepped forward to grab her, the chamber doors creaked open. Every head turned. A second black robe entered the room. Tall, calm, deliberate. The gold trim of his collar caught the light like a blade unsheathed. He wasn't rushed, but his presence changed everything. In one heartbeat, the air shifted. It was no longer just a courtroom. It was a battlefield, and reinforcements had just arrived. Justice Elijah Ward had entered, Senior Justice of the Supreme Court. Elijah Ward wasn't just any judge. He was the benchmark by which other justices measured their restraint. A constitutional purist, a former military legal advisor, a man known not for dramatic opinions, but for rulings so tightly reasoned, they left no space for error. He was the one judge Halden could not interrupt, outrank, or outmaneuver. And the message was unmistakable. Someone high up had sounded the alarm, and now the system was watching itself. Ward's steps were measured. He approached the bench without acknowledging Halden, which in itself was a slap across the face. Then he turned to Jasmine, his tone not soft, but precise, like every word had already been reviewed, approved, and chiseled into marble. Ms. Crockett, the court will now formally hear your defense. Your statements will be entered into the official record and reviewed at the federal level, if necessary. Jasmine gave a single nod, controlled, respectful. Her voice was low but resolute. Thank you, Your Honor. I do not take this opportunity lightly. She didn't look around the courtroom. She didn't need to. This wasn't about theatrics or performance. It was about truth on record. She had walked through fire to reach this moment, and now she stood at the edge of something greater than any verdict. The chance to set the record straight, not just for herself, but for everyone crushed by quiet power and unchecked process, and she would not let it slip. She took one breath, leveled her gaze, and turned back toward the center of the courtroom. Because now, the state's key witness had entered the room, and the truth was about to be tested in front of everyone. The courtroom door opened, smooth, controlled, no announcement, no theatrics, just procedure. But everyone felt it, like a tremor passing through the floor. A bailiff stepped forward and spoke with clipped formality. Your Honors, the court now calls Officer Nathan Ellis to the stand. Jasmine didn't blink. She knew this was coming. The man who started it all, the lone voice behind the citation, the invisible authority whose word had outweighed due process, paperwork, and evidence. He entered like a man used to winning, used to being believed. His uniform was pressed so tight it looked stitched into his skin, his face calm, confident, unreadable. 2 decades of enforcement experience written into the way he walked. Not fast, not slow, just like someone clocking in for another routine task. He raised his right hand, repeated the oath, and took his seat. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't have to. For most of his career, no one like her had ever dared question him. That was the unspoken truth now floating through the air. This wasn't just testimony. It was a confrontation long overdue. Chief Justice Ward gave a single nod toward Jasmine. It was all the permission she needed. She stood with calm precision, her expression steady, her voice smooth, not dramatic, not performative. It didn't have to be. "Officer Ellis," she began, "you issued the citation that led to this penalty, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he answered with mechanical ease. "Did you document the alleged violation with any photographs?" "No, ma'am, didn't need to." "Any written incident report, diagrams, video footage, signed witness statements?" He shifted in his chair slightly. "Number, I've been doing this a long time. I know a violation when I see one. So to be clear," Jasmine pressed, stepping closer to the bench so her voice carried to every corner of the room, "you issued a $15,000 fine based entirely on your own personal judgment, with no supporting evidence, no corroboration, just your word." He shrugged as if the absurdity of it had never occurred to him. "That's right. I've got 20 years in this job. That's what experience is for." And then she paused. Just for a second. Just long enough for the weight of that answer to sink in. Then she smiled. Barely. "Thank you for your honesty, officer," she said, voice razor clean. Then she turned slightly toward the bench, her tone cool, almost clinical. "What we've just heard is not testimony. It's an admission." You could feel the shift, like air being pulled out of the room. The state's sole witness has confirmed. There is no physical evidence, no report, no corroboration, no documentation of any kind. Only one man's opinion, delivered without review, without oversight, and without accountability. Her voice grew firmer now, not louder, just more precise. "Your Honors, what's being called a legal violation is in fact something else entirely. A personal interpretation dressed in a uniform and treated as fact." She turned back to Ellis, measured, controlled. "You didn't enforce a code, sir. You enforced a feeling." And then she looked directly at Chief Justice Ward, finishing with a clarity that struck like a final nail. "And when law becomes a matter of personal instinct, we are no longer protecting justice. We're gambling with it." The courtroom fell still, not just quiet, but hollow, like something sacred had just been taken apart in front of everyone. The kind of silence where no one dares to speak, because they're still absorbing what they just heard. Ellis sat stiffly, lips slightly parted like he'd just realized the depth of what he'd admitted. The clerk had stopped writing. Even the court reporter, trained to follow every word, seemed frozen. Because this wasn't a cross-examination anymore. This was exposure. And for the first time since this hearing began, there was no place left for the system to hide. Jasmine's final cross-examination of Officer Ellis had stripped the illusion bare. There was no defense left, just a hollow citation backed by muscle memory, not law. The courtroom wasn't moving anymore, not even breathing. The marble, the wood, the silence. They all felt heavier, like they were holding in the truth that no one dared say out loud. This wasn't justice. This had been a show. And then, slowly, Chief Justice Elijah Ward leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When a man like Ward speaks, it's not for volume, it's for record. "Let the court be clear," he said, his tone like a blade honed by decades of legal discipline. "No photographs, no documentation, no third-party testimony, no opportunity for cross-examination, no procedural foundation. This is not a ruling," he continued, eyes like steel. "This is a simulation of authority. It is not law. It is not order. It is control masquerading as process." A slow wave of stillness passed through the gallery, not like fear, but like awe. Someone exhaled. A pen dropped somewhere near the back, but no one turned. The moment was too thick, too final. Then Ward delivered the line that broke the illusion completely. Accordingly, the penalty imposed upon Ms. Jasmine Crockett is vacated in full, effective immediately. This case is closed. He didn't look at Halden when he said it. He didn't need to, because those few words had done what no one else in that room had the courage or the power to do. They didn't just protect Jasmine, they exposed the bench itself. Halden sat frozen. His fingers, once so firm on the gavel, were now curled loosely against the edge of the bench. His gaze dropped, not in contemplation, but in collapse. No fury, no argument. Just the quiet realization that he had been overruled not just legally, but publicly, on the record, in real time, inside the very courtroom where, for years, his word had been final. But not today. Today he had been met with truth, precision, and precedent. He bowed his head, not out of grace, but because there was nowhere left to look. The gallery didn't move. No applause, no whispers. The silence now wasn't fear or confusion. It was something closer to reverence. Everyone in that room had just witnessed the impossible. A power structure cracked open from the inside, and the man who once dominated with impunity now sat smaller than ever behind a bench that no longer shielded him. The ruling had been simple, but the message was seismic. Justice had returned, not with drama, but with discipline. And Halden, for the first time, was on the receiving end. The fallout didn't wait. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped through the heavy courthouse doors, the story had already started moving faster than any reporter could write it. Her name wasn't just in the press, it was in inboxes, legal memos, municipal briefings, policy meeting agendas. Because this wasn't just a courtroom win, it was a detonation inside the system itself. Within 72 hours, the shockwave hit. One city ordered a quiet internal review of all administrative fines issued over the past 5 years. Then 3 cities, then 10, then cities and states Jasmine had never even visited. From Portland to Pittsburgh, from tiny townships to sprawling metros, departments of compliance, licensing, and code enforcement began getting the same terrifying question from their legal counsel. Where's the evidence? Thousands of fines, citations, and penalties, ranging from sidewalk encroachment to business license suspensions, were suddenly under audit. Not because someone protested, but because someone proved they could. Jasmine's case had become precedent, and precedent was a dangerous thing when the system had grown comfortable skipping steps. In Detroit, a team of civil rights attorneys filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of small business owners fined without inspection reports. In San Antonio, the city council held an emergency session to freeze all property-related penalties pending documentation verification. In Philadelphia, a single mother who'd lost her home over a disputed trash fine walked back into court, this time with a copy of Crockett v. Monroe in her hand and a public defender who now believed she had a chance. It wasn't just cities, it was people, veterans, janitors, barbers, contractors, people who once paid without fighting back because the cost of resistance seemed higher than the fine itself. But now, they were coming back with folders, receipts, phone records, with questions no one had been forced to answer until now. Inside the system, the response was pure chaos. Municipal lawyers scrambled to rewrite enforcement protocols. Clerks quietly removed old guidance memos from shared drives. Mayors called emergency press briefings with pre-scripted talking points about transparency and process modernization. But behind the podiums, panic reigned. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't noisy. It was surgical. She hadn't stormed the gates. She had made the gates prove they were ever necessary in the first place. And the worst part, for them, was that she hadn't shouted. She hadn't raged. She hadn't even protested. She had used their own rules, their language, their logic. She had turned the system inward on itself, and now the cracks were visible to everyone. The Department of Justice launched a quiet inquiry into local enforcement practices across 3 states. Legal textbooks were updated. Law school professors restructured their lectures on administrative burden and procedural fairness. Even insurers who once provided liability coverage for municipal fines began pulling out, calling the space too volatile. But the real shift happened where no press cameras were allowed. Courtrooms. Judges started asking questions. Not once in a while, every time. Where's the photographic record? Was the accused informed and given time to respond? Is there a second officer's verification? What once passed as routine now unraveled under scrutiny. Prosecutors who used to win cases in under 10 minutes found themselves floundering under basic questions. Clerks double-checked files. Hearings got longer, slower, fairer. Not everyone was happy. Some officials painted Jasmine's case as an outlier, a fluke, a moment blown out of proportion. They warned of governance paralysis, said that if municipalities couldn't act swiftly, urban management would fall apart. One mayor in Florida even called her ruling the first crack in the wall of civil order. But their fear wasn't of chaos, it was of accountability. And across the country, it was spreading, not through protests or slogans, but through records. Citizens were filing public record requests. Journalists began publishing multi-part exposés. Local watchdog groups, once dismissed, suddenly had their phones ringing off the hook. And Jasmine, she didn't give interviews, didn't sign a book deal, didn't launch a movement. She walked away quietly. Let the transcript speak. Let the facts echo. Let the truth travel faster than her name. She hadn't meant to start anything. She had only wanted a hearing. But what she got was a reckoning. And in the days that followed the ruling, something began to shift. Not in riots or revolutions, but in the silence between headlines. Where legal newsletters once buried civil rights decisions on page 5, now her name led the cover. Where municipal boards once met behind closed doors, now they faced packed rooms of citizens quoting case law from a transcript that had circled the country. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a case. She had forced the system to hear itself. The media tried to name it. At first it was the Monroe reversal, then the due process decision. But none of those stuck. Because it wasn't just about a ruling, it was about a ripple. A wave of accountability that started in one courtroom and crashed through 1,000 city halls. Eventually, a headline from a quiet editorial in the Boston Globe said what everyone else had been circling around. The Jasmine effect, when one voice makes the law, listen again. And it caught fire. Civil rights organizations picked it up. Think tanks, law schools, even city clerks began using the term, half admiring, half terrified. It wasn't political, it wasn't partisan, it was procedural. And that's what made it unstoppable. Jasmine hadn't taken down the system. She'd simply demanded it follow its own rules. But the deeper impact wasn't seen on cable news. It was felt in small, untelevised moments. In a public library in Tulsa, a 68-year-old former attorney unboxed his law books, untouched since a disbarment triggered by a corrupt citation process. He began offering free consultations to veterans seeking restitution. In Bakersfield, California, a single father whose small business was shut down after an anonymous complaint found his fine quietly dismissed and his permit reactivated. In New Orleans, a young paralegal started organizing weekend workshops to teach working-class citizens how to challenge administrative penalties with proper documentation. They weren't activists, they were survivors, and Jasmine had given them not a slogan, but a blueprint. Meanwhile, within the walls of power, discomfort festered. Judges, once unflinching in their routines, now hesitated before signing off on enforcement orders. Clerks whispered to each other before scheduling hearings. Junior lawyers began citing Crockett versus Monroe in pretrial motions, and more importantly, winning. The idea that one officer's instinct could carry the weight of the law without evidence was no longer just dangerous. It was legally fragile. But Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't appear on talk shows. She didn't publish memoirs or pose for editorials. She left the courthouse the same way she had entered, with quiet purpose and an unshakable stare. Reporters waited at the steps, expecting a victory speech. There was none. She didn't feel like a victor. She felt like a combatant who had survived the unthinkable. Because what most people didn't understand was that this wasn't just a legal battle. It was personal, it was exhausting, and it was dangerous. Not because of physical threats, but because standing up inside the system is the one place you're not supposed to do it. She knew what it had cost her: the sleepless nights, the friends who told her to walk away, the isolation of knowing that if she failed, it wouldn't just be her reputation, it would be a message to every unheard citizen that speaking up gets you punished. And yet, she had stood, and because she stood, others now had ground to stand on. That's what made the Jasmine effect different. It wasn't a headline. It was a shift in posture, the quiet straightening of shoulders in courtrooms, the return of eye contact across legal tables. The sense, however fragile, that the law could be wrestled back into shape by those it once crushed. She didn't walk out of that courtroom like someone who'd won. She walked out like someone who had made it through. Her steps weren't triumphant. They were tactical. Every move forward was measured, not because she feared what came next, but because she was already preparing for it. The Jasmine effect didn't end at the courthouse steps. It didn't end when the fine was erased. It didn't even end when cities began rewriting policy. Because this was never about ending something. It was about reminding everyone what justice was supposed to look like. And Jasmine Crockett had done exactly that, not by breaking the system, but by making it see its own reflection and blink. Thought for a few seconds. The echo of Jasmine's victory had barely finished reverberating through America's courtrooms when the machinery she'd punctured began to re-engineer itself. In conference rooms with soundproof walls and oak tables longer than some city blocks, advisors mapped the threat on whiteboards: public trust dropping, case challenges rising, and, worst of all, budget lines at risk if fines were overturned en masse. They did not speak of citizens or due process. They spoke of revenue integrity and enforcement continuity. By dawn the following Monday, draft legislation circulated in email chains marked confidential, clauses that reinstated instant penalties as administrative cautions, surcharges renamed expedited compliance fees, and a proposed rule that any appeal must include a bond equal to the fine, so only those who could already pay could question power. The authors called it streamlining. Critics would soon call it a wall of glass knives. Meanwhile, a coalition of consulting firms offered crisis management packages to municipalities, talking points, data spin, and social media tracking to bury dissent under graphs no one could decipher. The goal wasn't to undo Jasmine's precedent in the courts, yet. The goal was to choke it with new rules before ordinary people realized how many doors had just been unlocked. And somewhere in every proposal, one line kept reappearing in bold: mitigate the Jasmine effect. Talk radio went on the offensive next. Morning hosts framed Jasmine not as a champion of fairness, but as an activist lawyer eager to paralyze local government. One syndicated pundit claimed her victory would unleash a plague of freeloaders who refuse to follow any ordinance that doesn't come with a photo album. Another warned elderly listeners that garbage would pile up in the streets if officers were forced to document every infraction. It was fear distilled into 30-second sound bites, quick enough to bypass critical thought, sharp enough to leave a sting. Holden's allies fed the frenzy with leaked memos that painted him as a martyr of judicial discretion, a man unfairly ambushed by media optics. Editorial cartoons showed Jasmine wielding a gavel like an axe, chopping City Hall pillars into dust while taxpayers screamed for rescue. The narrative was clear. She hadn't protected the vulnerable. She'd endangered civilization. And yet, when phone lines opened for public calls, something unexpected slipped through the screen of outrage by design. Veterans thanking Jasmine. Single mothers sharing their own citation nightmares. Callers asking why fines arrive faster than evidence. Opponents cut to commercials. Hope, it turned out, was poor radio. In state capitals, lobbyists stitched the fear into law. Texas's Rapid Ordinance Enforcement Act proposed a return to on-the-spot penalties, cloaked in language about public safety emergencies. Georgia's Municipal Integrity Bond Bill required citizens to deposit the full amount of any fine before a hearing could be scheduled, ostensibly to discourage frivolous appeals. In Florida, a draft statute tried to grant code officers presumptive evidentiary privilege, meaning their word would legally satisfy the burden of proof unless contradicted by two independent sources. Committee rooms filled with half-truths about clogged dockets and sprawling urban decay. Data sets were cherry-picked. Average processing time charts excluded the very courts Jasmine's precedent had slowed, because slow now meant thorough. Civil rights advocates scrambled to decode the bills, while lawmakers scheduled rapid-fire votes, hoping public attention would lag behind legislative speed. But every rushed hearing left a record, and every record contained the same silent admission. The system feared sunlight more than protest. Halden himself resurfaced with calculated restraint. He gave one interview, just enough to reframe his collapse as a procedural misunderstanding magnified by sentimentality. He cited respect for due process while never mentioning his attempt to bypass it. Subtle digs at Jasmine slipped into his answers. There is a difference between emotional persuasion and lawful argumentation, he said, knowing most viewers wouldn't read the transcript that proved she'd mastered both. Behind closed doors, he attended fundraisers hosted by enforcement union PACs. Their members feared body cameras would soon point at building inspectors and code officers, eroding old assumptions that an official badge equaled unquestioned truth. At one gathering, Halden received a standing ovation when he declared, "No single case will rewrite the architecture of municipal authority," a line that found its way into press releases the next morning. But taped to the inside of every gift bag was a briefing on the Jasmine effect. The number of fines already vacated nationwide, the lawsuits pending, the municipalities in open audit. It read less like a victory lap and more like a weather report for a gathering storm. Meanwhile, Jasmine became the subject of dossiers rather than features. Opposition researchers pieced through her past looking for a missed tax payment, a parking ticket, any contradiction that could undercut her credibility. Finding none, they pivoted to painting her as an elitist, former military prosecutor turned activist. The implication being that discipline and dissent could not share the same skin. Anonymous accounts circulated rumors of a secret donor network bankrolling her efforts. One tabloid ran a story claiming she planned to run for Congress. Ignoring the fact that she hadn't given a single public statement since the verdict, friends warned her the smear machine would only worsen. Jasmine answered with the same calm that had stunned Halden. Let them dig. Truth doesn't bury easy. Her refusal to engage unsettled her detractors. Outrage marketing sputters when the target won't play. Still, she tightened her circle, encrypted her communications, and moved her client meetings to a co-working space with cameras at every exit. Because intention wasn't the only threat, perception could be weaponized just as fast. Grassroots defenders surfaced to meet the backlash. A retired judge in Oregon launched an online database cataloging every non-evidentiary fine in his state, inviting citizens to search their addresses and join group petitions. A network of pro bono litigators formed the Crockett Alliance, offering template motions to dismiss evidence-free citations. TikTok videos explaining how to request proof of your fine in 60 seconds racked up millions of views. Municipal PR teams tried to respond with explainer graphics showing why documentation slows efficiency, but side-by-side memes comparing efficiency versus justice spread faster. On Reddit, a crowdsourced map marked cities that still relied on officer discretion alone. Within weeks, the map glowed red like a heat signature of neglect. For every lawmaker pushing a rollback bill, a thread emerged listing their largest campaign donors and how much revenue their district generated from instant fines. The backlash had triggered counter-backlash, and now traditional gatekeepers struggled to keep the narrative contained. In a Washington, D.C. think tank conference ironically titled Future-Proofing Municipal Governance, panelists debated whether the Jasmine effect threatened the republic or revitalized it. A city manager argued fines needed to remain swift to deter scofflaws. A civil rights scholar retorted that deterrence built on secrecy was just tyranny in a vest. When audience Q&A opened, a gray-haired man who introduced himself as a former nobody from East Street, Louis, told the room he'd paid a $2,500 derelict property fine on a house he still lived in, because the inspector never got out of his car to see renovations inside. Silence swallowed the hall. Panelists stumbled over policy jargon. The story needed no footnotes. Outside, journalists cornered the man for comment. He held up Jasmine's case printout and said, "I just want my name cleared." That night, his quote went viral, and every bill pushing new barriers to appeals looked suddenly brutally inhumane. All the while, Jasmine remained a shadow in her own story, walking the tightrope between symbol and solicitor. She spent mornings drafting motions for clients emboldened by her precedent, afternoons fielding calls from grassroots organizers, and nights scanning legislative trackers for the next attempt to mutate due process into red tape. She spoke only when filings required her voice, refusing talk show invitations even when they offered prime time. Reporters camped outside her modest office. She slipped in through a side alley. Not because she feared rhetoric, she'd faced artillery, but because she knew the backlash relied on turning a person into a pedestal. Knock over the pedestal. The cause looks brittle. She wouldn't give them the pleasure. Yet behind her quiet defiance, exhaustion stalked. Every email flagged urgent, every client story more heartbreaking than the last, every headline trying to twist her into either savior or villain. Friends urged her to take a week off. She smiled and quoted her father. "If the other side's loading their magazines, it's not time for coffee." But at night, alone, she replayed her cross-examination of Ellis, reminding herself why discipline matters when rage would feel so much easier. In that courtroom, she'd proven precision could defeat power. Now she had to live by the same rule in an arena with no clear rules at all. Then in midsummer came the pivot no one expected, an official invitation from the Department of Justice to join a federal advisory board on administrative enforcement standards. It was the kind of olive branch that could either legitimize her influence or co-opt it into silence. Advocates urged acceptance. Get inside the room where decisions are made. Skeptics warned it was a velvet cage. They want to neutralize you, not empower you. Jasmine read the letter once, twice, left it face down on her desk, and stared at the blank wall, searching for the line between collaboration and compromise. She knew whichever path she chose, backlash would morph again, like water seeking cracks. But she also knew this. Every time the system tried to close a door, the people who now believed in her were pushing 10 more open. The Jasmine effect had become more than a headline. It was a contest of stamina between those who wield power without proof and those who refused to be silent any longer. And as the backlash rallied its resources and sharpened its paperwork, Jasmine understood the truth that had carried her through the first fight. Whenever power feels threatened, it shows its teeth. The trick is to make sure the bite finally fails to land. Thought for a couple of seconds. The late afternoon light in Washington filtered through blinds like prison bars when the knock rattled Jasmine's office door. She had been sifting through deposition transcripts, searching for one exculpatory sentence that might spare a mechanic in Milwaukee from bankruptcy. The sudden sound cut through her concentration, sharp as a gavel crack. She glanced at the small wall clock, 6:47 p.m., well past walk-in hours. Most callers these days were reporters or opportunists hoping to turn the Jasmine effect into a brand. Yet something in the rhythm of that knock, steady, polite, but insistent, felt different. Jasmine rose, reminding herself to breathe, and opened the door. A woman of maybe 50 stood on the threshold, clutching a battered manila envelope to her chest as if it were a life vest. Her uniform blazer hung loose on her shoulders, the corrections officer patch half removed, its edges frayed like a story no one had cared to finish. She looked at Jasmine the way soldiers look at medics in the middle of gunfire, with equal parts desperation and reluctant hope. Jasmine stepped aside and motioned her in. The office was a repurposed storage loft above a used bookstore. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and open case files covered every surface like battle plans. The woman introduced herself in a voice roughened by years of shouting over prison din. Linda Green, 27 years in state corrections, widowed, recently forced into early retirement after her home was condemned by a city inspector. No appeal, no explanation beyond a red notice nailed to the front door. They called it immediate safety risk, Linda said, passing Jasmine the envelope. But they never even walked past the porch. Inside lay a single citation form. No photographs, no inspection sheet, no signature except the block print of a code officer who, according to the date stamp, had completed the entire process in under 4 minutes. The fine, $38,000. The deadline to vacate, 72 hours. Linda and her disabled son had spent the last month living in a motel, while interest compounded daily on a lien she could never repay. She'd filed public records requests, visited City Hall, begged for the inspection report. No department could locate one. "They told me I could fix everything," Linda whispered, "if I just paid the fine first." Jasmine's jaw tightened. She thought of Daniel Rhee's checkbox, Karen Bautista's silent code change, James Weller's 17 inches, each one a scalpel cut made by invisible hands. She asked Linda if the house had real problems, foundation cracks, mold, anything. Linda shook her head. "Built by my husband before he passed. I sink my pension into repairs every year. The roof's newer than my car." Jasmine flipped the citation over. Blank backside. No evidence field, no compliance pathway, just an account number and routing instructions for electronic transfer. It was a ransom note disguised in municipal letterhead. Jasmine felt the familiar burn of rage in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "We'll contest," she said. "We'll demand discovery, full disclosure, then we'll bury them under their own paperwork." Linda's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Corrections officers know how to hold the line. She merely nodded and asked, "Am I crazy to fight?" Jasmine answered the only way she could. "Crazy would be letting them convince you silence is cheaper." The next morning, Jasmine filed a petition for immediate injunctive relief in Superior Court, citing Crockett versus Monroe as controlling precedent on evidence-free enforcement actions. She requested a temporary stay on the lien, a full release of all inspection records, and, if no documentation surfaced, a dismissal with prejudice and financial restitution for costs incurred under wrongful condemnation. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the last line but stamped it anyway. Jasmine's name now carried the weight of a seismic footnote. She copied the city attorney's office, then drove to Linda's condemned house. Paint peeling, grass overgrown, yet structurally sound at first glance. A red placard still clung to the doorframe like a scarlet letter. Jasmine photographed every angle, measuring tape in hand, documenting the absence of structural failure. A neighbor peeked through their blinds. Word of the Jasmine effect traveled faster than gossip. She asked if inspectors had canvassed the street the day of the citation. The neighbor shook his head. "I was on the porch all morning. No city truck, no clipboard." Jasmine jotted the statement, filing it under non-agency eyewitness. City Hall responded 2 days later with a motion to dismiss the injunction, arguing that administrative decisions were non-justiciable pending internal review. Jasmine read it once, smirked, then drafted her reply. Internal review cannot retroactively invent evidence. She subpoenaed the inspector's body cam footage, only to learn none existed. She subpoenaed phone GPS logs, nothing. She subpoenaed the officer himself, one Charles Drummond, for deposition. He arrived with counsel, a middle-aged man wearing a smug grin and a tie clip shaped like an eagle clutching a flag. Under oath, Jasmine asked if he'd ever stepped inside the residence. He hesitated, glanced at his lawyer, then said, "Visual assessment from the curb is standard practice." Jasmine pounced. "So you condemned a home, displaced 2 residents, and triggered a $38,000 lien without entering the property, photographing the alleged hazards, or issuing a corrective notice?" Drummond adjusted his tie but answered yes. His lawyer tried to object, but Jasmine read aloud the city code requiring documented evidence of hazard and opportunity for cure. She slid across the table a fresh printout of Crockett versus Monroe. Drummond's lawyer called for a recess. Word of the deposition leaked by sunset. Local news cut into programming. Former corrections officer battles city over phantom inspection. Social media threads exploded with hashtag show the proof. The city PR office released a statement claiming, "Public safety requires swift action." Jasmine counterfiled a motion to compel immediate release of all inspection policies, citing the public's right to transparency. Overnight, an anonymous drop reached her email. Internal memos instructing inspectors to maximize fee revenue by flagging older houses for proactive hazard mitigation. The memo highlighted fines as cost-neutral tools to encourage voluntary relocation in gentrifying districts. Jasmine forwarded the documents to investigative journalists. By dawn, headlines screamed of eviction via paperwork. Council members scrambled for damage control, scheduling a special session to discuss potential abuses of code enforcement. Court day arrived like a second storm. Spectators packed the gallery, veterans, retirees, young activists clutching printed copies of the Jasmine Effect articles. Linda sat beside Jasmine, hands clasped, knuckles white. Across the aisle, the city attorney's team shuffled binders filled with newly created reports, evidence manufactured after the fact. The judge, a seasoned jurist with a reputation for impatience, opened by asking one question: "Counsel, do you have contemporaneous documentation from the day of inspection? Yes or no?" The city attorney hedged. Jasmine stood and provided the subpoena returns. GPS logs showing the inspector never left his truck, timestamp data contradicting his sworn statement, and the revenue memo. She spoke calmly, each sentence a nail. This condemnation was never about safety. It was about displacement for profit, and it relied on the same logic this court rejected in Crockett versus Monroe. Instinct in place of evidence. Gas rippled through the room. The judge turned to the city attorney. Any substantive rebuttal? There was none. Ruling from the bench, the judge vacated the lien, ordered immediate restoration of the property, and referred the inspector's testimony for perjury review. He also mandated the city produce a plan within 30 days to overhaul its code enforcement procedures. When his gavel fell, Linda exhaled a breath she'd been holding for weeks. Reporters surged forward. Someone asked if Jasmine felt vindicated. She shook her head. This isn't vindication, it's triage, and there are a lot more wounds to treat. 2 hours later, Jasmine's inbox overflowed. A retired bus driver in Ohio fined for peeling paint. A daycare owner in Oregon cited for potential noise violations before opening day. A widower in New Jersey whose vegetable garden was labeled commercial agriculture and taxed accordingly. Each message carried the same refrain: "I saw what you did for Linda. Can you help me?" Jasmine read them all. She couldn't take every case, but she could carve a path. She uploaded document templates, sample discovery requests, and a step-by-step guide on demanding proof. Volunteer lawyers from the Crockett Alliance signed on to triage. Law students offered research hours. Within a week, 1,000 downloads became 10,000. The Jasmine Effect was no longer a headline. It was a network. The backlash took notice. State senators scheduled hearings to fast-track the bond posting bills. Editorials mocked due process freeloaders. Jasmine received an unmarked envelope containing a single typed line: "Stop before someone gets hurt." She reported it, then filed 3 more motions. Fear was the currency of bullies. She refused to pay. Instead, she met with federal officials to discuss national guidelines for evidence-based enforcement. She insisted on public forums, live-stream Q&As, and community input. Bureaucrats balked. Transparency slows consensus. She countered, "If consensus means secrecy, we don't need it." Late one night, exhaustion finally crept past her defenses. She sat alone in her office, lights off, the city blinking outside the window. On her desk lay Linda's vacated lien notice stamped, "Rescinded." Jasmine traced the word with her finger. Rescinded was not a win, it was a reset. But in a world where power relied on inertia, a reset was revolution. She allowed herself one small smile, then opened a fresh legal pad. At the top, she wrote, "Next steps, national policy draft, class action coordination, inspector body cam mandate." She paused, clicked her pen twice, and added one more line in bold letters. "Remind them, proof is power, silence is surrender." Somewhere across town, city officials huddled under fluorescent lights, rewriting ordinances to outpace her. In state capitals, lobbyists sharpened talking points, and in living rooms nationwide, ordinary people refreshed court dockets, waiting to see if their own silent battles might find voice. The war for due process had moved beyond one courtroom, beyond one fine, beyond one name. It was now a relay. Each victory a baton passed to the next citizen willing to ask the simplest, most dangerous question. "Show me the evidence." Jasmine closed her notebook, stood and stretched. The next sunrise would bring fresh fights, new bruises, and, with luck, another crack in the facade. She turned off the desk lamp, stepped into the hallway, and locked the door behind her. The night air greeted her like a challenge. She square-shouldered it, steady and unafraid, because somewhere out there, another knock would come. And when it did, she'd be ready to open the door. And as the door to Jasmine's office closed behind her that night, the war didn't end. It simply moved into new inboxes, new courtrooms, new voices. The system, wounded but unbroken, would regroup. Bureaucracy never sleeps. But something had changed. Not on the surface, not in laws passed or headlines printed, but somewhere deeper. In the marrow of a country so used to looking away from small injustices, it had finally been forced to look inward. And what it saw was something uncomfortable, something unignorable. A mirror held up by a woman who never raised her voice, yet made the entire institution flinch. Because at its core, this wasn't a story about the law. It was a story about being seen. The lesson wasn't buried in precedent or constitutional clauses. It was in the moments between gavel strikes, in the way Jasmine stood still while the room turned against her. It was in the silence after she asked for proof, and none came. It was in the humiliation of Linda Green, condemned not by evidence, but by absence. In Daniel Rhee's lost garage. In Karen Bautista's erased license. In James Weller's fence and the $10,000 that stole his peace. The real punishment wasn't the fine. It was the message behind it. You don't matter. You don't belong. You don't get to ask why. That's what Jasmine fought. Not just a ruling, but a culture of quiet punishment wrapped in official paper. And the system almost won, because that's how it's designed, to make the cost of standing unbearable, to drain you before you even begin, to wrap injustice in so many layers of language and process that by the time you find the truth, it's too late to fight. But Jasmine didn't accept that. She stood her ground in a courtroom where the verdict was written before she spoke, and she rewrote it, not with fury, but with facts. She didn't explode. She surgically dismantled. And by doing so, she reminded every soul watching that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to move. There's a reason her name shook city halls. It wasn't just what she said. It was how undeniable she made it. She didn't appeal to pity. She appealed to principle. She made the system choke on its own logic until it had no choice but to retreat. And that's the lesson the country must remember now. Not just the legal precedent, but the human precedent. That the voice of one person, sharp, prepared, unafraid, can force an empire of indifference to stop pretending. That ordinary people, when pushed far enough, will stop asking for permission and start demanding truth. Justice, after all, isn't just a concept. It's a muscle. And like any muscle, it weakens when not used. Jasmine reminded a nation how to flex it again. How to look a judge in the eye and say, that's not the law, that's just your word. How to call a fine what it really is, a sentence without a trial. How to reclaim not just your rights, but your worth. Because in the end, this story wasn't about Jasmine winning. It was about the people who, for the first time, saw someone like them win and realized they could too. That they didn't need to shout to be powerful. They needed to prepare, to persist, to refuse to disappear. Jasmine didn't give them magic. She gave them strategy, a blueprint, a roadmap through the maze of modern oppression disguised as order. And that may be the most dangerous gift of all. The system is still watching, still testing its boundaries, still waiting for fatigue to set in. But now it knows someone is watching back, and they know her name. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.